Hi, so this week we're going to explore a theory called information processing. And this theory gives us some ideas about potentially how we take in information, we use the system to sort of process it and get to the point of perception, and then how we potentially use that information to choose and then to activate a motor response in relation to that incoming sensory information. All right, so let's get started. All right, so let's start out with the definition of information processing. So the definition actually is an examination of what's occurring in the system itself between when you receive information from the environment. So receiving or any input can be sensory information, visual information, any sort of information, olfactory information, any information that's coming into the system. And then once that sensory information comes into the system or the input comes into the system, what you do is you somehow process it. And this processing actually encompasses things like encoding the information or combining it with other pieces of sensory information to put together this perceptual picture of what's happening. So as you can see in the diagram below, we have input coming in, and again, any sort of sensory input coming in. Then the black box is what's actually happening within the person, and that's processing. And then there is some output, and that's generally for us, we're thinking about motor output. And so we can see and detect the input or measure it. We can see and detect the output or the motor response. But what's happening within this box, this processing that's happening, we can't actually directly see. And so sometimes it's called the black box because, again, we can't actually see what's happening, but we do know something's happening. So what is it that we think is happening? Let's talk about that. All right, so as we're thinking about processing, there's two definitions that are going to be important to us in relation to how things potentially may be processed. The first thing we want to think about is serial versus parallel processing. So serial processing is where things are put together and assembled in a specific order. So something comes first, something comes second after that, and then after that something comes third and is processed. So one thing is processed at a time and multiple things are processed in a row. Parallel processing is where things are processed simultaneously. So you process both sensory information and visual information, or somatosensory and visual, simultaneously and put them together. So if you look at the example below, assembly of a car, we have the assembly of the engine, the assembly of the electronic system, and the assembly of the body. And those would be representing parallel processing. Those processes are going on simultaneously. And then serial processing is represented once all those things are assembled separately, then we assemble things together. And so we have final assembly and then a test drive. And those would be serial processing methods. So if we think about this in relation to how we may be processing information, it may be, and it's theorized, that initially we take in the sensory information, we decide what's important for us at the moment, and we put together visual information, somatosensory information, olfactory information, any sort of information that's coming to us, and we combine it into a perceptual picture. Once we get that perceptual picture, then we move on to figure out what is potentially the appropriate response and then how to program it, which we're going to talk about next. All right, so now we're going to take our next step at looking at potentially what's happening in this black box. So you can see in the diagram below, we've now expanded this black box to include three different potential processes going on: stimulus identification, response selection, and response programming. And these three potential stages of information processing are actually what's make up our reaction time. So this reaction time is the time between the stimulus that we receive and our movement output. And we need to think about this reaction time because sometimes in our subjects, this reaction time is long, and we can see a change in reaction time with practice. So let's spend a moment and talk about what each one of these stages may represent for us or is theorized to represent. All right, so the first stage of information processing is stimulus identification. And as you sort of saw from the previous figure, or the figure in the previous slide, this probably happens first, so probably in serial in relation to information processing. And what's happening during stimulus identification is we're actually figuring out what are the environmental cues that are important to us at the moment, and then trying to put together this picture of the environment and what's happening. So there are two parts of stimulus identification: stimulus detection and pattern recognition. Stimulus detection is when we make a decision to focus our attention on some sort of incoming information. These are also identified as neurological impulses. And at that point, we then use or arouse or try to recall something in our memory to something that's happening or some stimulus that's coming in. The important things about stimulus detection are the clarity of the stimulus coming in. So is it clear or is it masked by something else that's going on? And then in addition to clarity is the intensity. How strong is the input that's coming in? All right, so stimulus detection comes first. Then there's pattern recognition, which is our ability to recognize the pattern of the stimulation from the environment. And the important thing about pattern recognition is our experience with that pattern. So if we have extensive experience with that pattern, we're more likely to recognize it. And then there's some patterns that are probably genetically defined. So for example, if you have an optic flow, or if you detect optic flow and something coming at you very quickly, you're going to react by ducking or by putting up an arm, or sort of like a very quick response, which some people call reflexive, but it's probably just a very quick response to defend yourself. So stimulus identification, the first and probably in a serial progression, and stimulus identification has two parts: the detection of the stimulus and then recognizing the pattern. All right, so the second process or stage of information processing that is theorized is the response selection. And basically what's happening in response selection is you're selecting which response to activate in response to the stimulus that you're receiving. There's a couple of things that impact your response selection and the time that it takes you to go through this stage of information processing. The first is the number of stimulus response alternatives. As the number of responses or alternatives to the response increase, your response time will increase. And this is actually called Hicks' law. And there's a lot of research demonstrating Hicks' law. That's why it's a law versus a theory, because we have so much evidence on it. And so as the number of responses or potential responses increases, it takes you longer to filter through all these potential responses and longer to make a decision. Thus, your response time increases. The next thing that impacts response selection is that we're going to talk about is compatibility and complexity of the actions. So if we think about spatial compatibility, and there's again a lot of research on this. So if you're being asked to push a button with either the left hand or the right hand, and you have two lights in front of you, one on the left and one on the right. You have a spatial compatibility in this activity. So if the light on the left goes on, you have a better compatibility, spatial compatibility, to push with the left hand. And then if the light on the right comes on, again, a better spatial compatibility to push with the right hand. If you reverse these, so if when the left light comes on, you're being asked to push with the right hand, and if the right light comes on, you're being asked to push with the left hand, the time that it takes you to respond or to select this response increases. Your response time will increase, which is what is demonstrated in the figure on the right. Also, the stimulus response compatibility related to how you're intending to use an item. So if you are opening a cabinet, for example, and you're going to reach in and grab a glass, if the glass is stored face down, or opening side down, and you're going to use that glass to pour something into and to drink out of, which is what we usually use glasses for, theoretically, the response time to program that when the glass is down and to turn your hand and to turn it over would take you a little bit longer, versus if it's stored with the opening upright. And so again, how you intend to use the item. If, however, you always have your glasses that way, and you know that your glasses are going to be that way just through the sheer practice and repetition of pulling a glass out when it's stored in the way that you're used to using it, will again affect response time, and your response time would decrease. So there's a couple of things that sort of go into this compatibility and the complexity of the actions, the way you rehearse and the way you use things regularly, for one thing, and then also the spatial relationship. And again, with practice, this response time will decrease. But if it's something that's novel or new to you and it throws you off, it will result in a longer response time. The third and final stage that we're going to talk about in relation to information processing is response programming. And this is exactly what it sounds like. You're organizing and initiating the actions. So you're putting in things like what's going to move, how it's going to move, the timing of the movement. And this is affected by three different characteristics of the movement. The first one is the number of moving parts. So obviously, the more moving parts you have, the more complex the motor command has to be, and this increases your response time because you have to program more. The movement accuracy also affects response programming and the time that it takes you. So if you have to be extremely precise with your movements, that's going to increase your response time. The less precise your movements have to be, the shorter the response time. The third thing that affects response programming is movement duration. So if you need more time to do the movement, and or if the movement needs frequent timing put into it, so you have to delay and then start and then delay and then restart, or time exactly what you're doing to meet something else, that's also going to increase the response time that you need. So the third step, response programming, has three parts: number of moving parts, the movement accuracy, and the movement duration. All of those characteristics affect response programming. All right, so now let's think about the clinical implications of information processing and how each one of these stages may affect what our learner is experiencing or what our performer is experiencing. So if we just think about stimulus identification, we have to detect that a stimuli is coming in, and we also have to recognize the pattern of of what's coming in. And so experience is going to allow us to recognize patterns in our environment more quickly. And in addition, the intensity may not have to be so strong for us. The clarity and the intensity we may be able to cue into this pattern easier with a not as strong intensity with experience. If we think about response selection, the number of stimulus alternatives, if we provide an environment where there's lots of alternatives versus if we sort of focus the alternatives and we get somebody closer to eliminating some alternatives that may not work, and then focus them more on alternatives that will be successful, we've now decreased the number of response alternatives. Also, with practice, you're going to hone in on alternatives that have been successful in the past, and so that will also decrease. Also, compatibility and complexity of the actions. So the more rehearsal we give, the stronger the compatibility is between the response, the stimulus, and the response that we're going to select. So again, rehearsal is important in response selection. Response programming, the higher the number of moving parts, the more things we have to control. That's going to increase the response time that we have, or the accuracy, or the duration. And again, with practice, this programming, once we get a program down and it becomes more rote for us, this has a little bit less impact. But definitely for response programming, there's a lot of things we can do in the clinic potentially to assist somebody, maybe initially helping them with the number of moving parts, or decreasing the movement accuracy, or helping them with a longer duration activity by decreasing or breaking things up into parts. May actually help us as we're getting somebody through some rehearsal. So the next major topic we're going to talk about, that we've sort of alluded to in information processing for this week, is the topic of attention. So attention is really going to be important in that first part of information processing, where we're identifying a stimulus and trying to picture or to find a pattern in there, maybe recognize a pattern. And our attention to the information that's coming in and attending to specific parts of the information that's coming in is going to be important as we think about information processing. So we're actually going to talk about 8 separate little topics under attention. We're going to talk about the types of attention. We're going to talk about attention and consciousness. We're going to talk about attention as a capacity or a resource. We're going to talk about selective attention, automatic and controlled processing, some theories of attention, some interference potentially of a task, and then anticipation and how that could help us and potentially hurt us as well. All right, so let's think about the types of attention that are mentioned in the literature. And these may be important for us as we're thinking about interacting, providing intervention, or even our examination or evaluation. So focused attention. This is the ability to focus in and find the piece of incoming stimulus that is going to be important to us. This is that ability to focus on something within our environment. Sustained attention is the ability to maintain that focused attention or maintain attention on something that might be important to me over a period of time. This is actually, if you have any knowledge of ADHD, this is where children who have attention deficit disorder, this is where they have a problem, is sustaining attention. They can generally focus their attention for a short amount of time, but having the ability to sustain attention to something. And again, with our patients with head injuries or patients who've had some sort of potentially concussion, this might be an area for them of sustained attention. Selective attention is when you're in an environment that there's a lot of things going on, and it can draw your attention away that you can selectively attend to one thing and then maybe potentially sustain that attention. So selective attention, finding something in a very overwhelming environment that is important to you and sustaining it. Alternating attention is the ability to shift your attention from one thing to another. So if you're working on something in your office or you're working with something with your patient and their family comes in and they shift their attention to something else, but then can they shift it back? Divided attention is, again, we're getting into like dealing with multiple tasks. So this gets more towards dual tasking and how do I do two things at once. Now, if you stop and you think about all of these definitions of attention, you'll probably can get an example or think of an example of when each of these has been important in the clinic and to our clients as they're trying to attend to and identify stimuli. All right, so the next topic we're going to talk about when we're thinking about attention is actually one that's really important to us as PTs and is probably one that we violate frequently in the clinic. But this next piece of information has been extremely well documented in the literature by the work done by Gabriella Wolf, who is currently at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And I've seen her present on this numerous times, and she recently came out with an optimal theory of motor learning, which we'll cover later on in the class. But when she's looking at teaching a motor skill, we need to think about where we're directing the learner's attention. And so she has repeatedly set up paradigms where she's directing the learner's attention to an external focus versus an internal focus. And I'll give you an example of this. So in one of her first pieces of work, she had 3 groups. She had an internal focus group, an external focus group, and a control group. So she had them on this slalom machine, which you see in the figure there. And so it was a new and novel task for them. So they were all sort of learning what to do. They had to not have any experience on this instrument prior to the study. So with the internal focus group, she instructed them to concentrate and to focus on their foot and how their foot was moving while they were learning this skill. The external focus group, she actually asked them to focus on the wheel that was underneath the platform that they were standing on. So really they were focusing on the piece of the apparatus that was moving. And in the third group was just a control group. They weren't given any instructions. And what we see in this study and in the times that she's repeated this is the external focus group who is concentrating on the movement that was actually occurring, so where the action was actually occurring, performed in practice and retained the skill. So they learned, which again, we'll get into the definition of learning versus performance as we go forward into motor learning, that they repeatedly have had better results. And this is extremely consistent. She's repeated this over and over and over again. And actually, I've had a pretty good couple of experiences with this theory with my own children. So I'll give you 2 stories. The first one is my daughter, who was about 7, maybe 6 or 7 at the time, decided she wanted to play baseball. And so it was a co-ed baseball team, and the coach was trying to teach her how to bat. And so she would be standing at the plate to bat for baseball, and he would tell her, okay, what you have to do is take a step and swing the bat. And so she would actually literally take a step and then swing the bat. And it was the most uncoordinated movement you've ever seen. And so he was giving her this cue, this internal focus cue to take a step. And then he actually also gave her coaching on how she was supposed to move her hands to swing the bat. So He kept giving her these cues, and I actually was doing my PhD at the time and had known about this research by Gabriella Wolf. So I took her home. I hung a ball from a tree so that it was stable. And then I gave her like a little plate, and I said to her, take the bat and think about the tip of the bat or the place where the bat would hit the ball. So I put a little sticker there. And I told her to take that sticker and to pull it as far back behind her as possible and sort of up in a good stance position. And then I told her to swing the bat and pull that sticker as far forward as she possibly could. And we practiced this a few times, and she started getting a very smooth looking swing. And part of that was probably because, and again, we'll talk about this as we get into postural control. A lot of that movement of swinging the bat is a postural control response, so that you can get a very fast, quick swing of the bat. And she did pretty well. And then she went back and was doing okay behind the plate. And then the coach told her, don't forget, take a step and then move your hands like this. And as soon as he said that, her whole swing broke down. And she wasn't able to produce the same pattern that she had previously. And he even said something to her like, what happened? Everything just broke. So that's one example. I also have another example with my kids when they were ice hockey players, and the coach was trying to teach them how to do what's called a wrist shot. Now, I, again, know nothing about, well, I know something about hockey, but again, this coach knew way more about hockey than I did. And he came off the ice as they were taking a little break and said, these kids just can't learn the wrist shot. And I was listening to him coach them, and he was telling them exactly how to move their wrist. And I said, So I ran out to my car. I got more stickers, because every good pediatric therapist has stickers with them at all times. And I put stickers on the end of his stick. And I said, here's a bunch of stickers. Put them on the ends of the kids' sticks where you want the puck to hit the stick. And tell them how you want them to move that sticker. He did. And he came off the ice and he said, I don't know what kind of magic that was, but it worked. So again, this is very important for us as therapists, and I think probably one of the biggest issues that we violate constantly is we're constantly giving people internal focus as we direct their attention. And there is a plethora of research that suggests this does not work. So again, something that we as PTs really need to address. All right, so the next topic we're going to cover under attention is attention as a capacity or a resource. So we can actually see that we run out of attention, that we get interference to adding more things to attend to at some points of learning, or even if we're doing something and somebody else tries to present another activity to us. So when we see interference with attention, we see one of four things happen. We see either that the second activity that somebody brings to us, or the second piece of information that somebody's trying to deliver to us, even if it's regarding the same activity, will suffer, that we can't attend to it, or if we're doing something, that activity will suffer in speed or quality. We can also see the reverse, that if we believe that second piece of information or that second thing that we need to do is more important, that first thing that we're doing can either suffer in speed or quality. We can see both the first and the second activity suffer in speed or quality, or we can actually see that second activity just being ignored while we continue on with the first activity, or the reverse could happen. So if both tasks that we're doing, or if even the first task and then listening to somebody tell us about a second task are too demanding, we may have some limit in capacity to attend. So we can see interference as either a structural or a capacity interference. So structural interference is when two physical structures are limiting our ability. So an example of that would be writing or taking a note and then having to push a button or dial a phone. We're using our hand, and so doing both of those things simultaneously is a structural interference. Capacity interference is when we get a breakdown of the performance secondary to a limitation in our ability to attend. An example of this might be I remember distinctly learning to drive a manual transmission when I was 16 and learning to drive a car, and my mom saying something to me and trying to give me a pointer, and I was like, I actually even remember saying to her, listen, I can't listen to what you're saying right now. I have so much, I'm just trying to get the car in gear and get the pedals going where it's going. So that would actually be a capacity interference. It took so much of my attention to be doing what I was doing that I had no more left over. I'm happy to say now when I drive a manual transmission, I can talk and shift the car at the same time. So again, this is something that changes with time and learning potentially, but we do see it present even in our clients in the clinic. So we need to keep aware of this as we're working with people in the clinic, that if they are spending all their attention doing what we're asking them to do, that listening to us or getting our feedback may actually be interfering with what they're doing. All right, so the next topic we're going to discuss as far as attention is selective attention. And most of the time, the way we select our attention is very intentional. So we can voluntarily choose where we attend to or what we're attending to in our environment. So we select specific sources of information that are important to us at the moment. And so we're in control of this during most of the time. One exception to this is involuntary intention changes. And this happens when there may be very important information coming to us that could signal danger or something that is extremely important in relation to what we're doing. And this is called involuntary. It's an automatic response. We shift our attention. This happens frequently. If somebody shouts your name very loud, sometimes you'll shift your attention. An example of this was when one of my children was playing soccer one day when they were younger, and they have my child has an unusual name, but there just happened to be a child on the other team who also had that name, and so he's really not used to somebody shouting his name, and the coach on the other team shouted this name a few times, very loudly, in a manner that made you think that you needed to attend to what they were saying. And so my child came off the field and was like, it's so frustrating because every time that coach yells out the name, I get distracted. And so this is a great example of involuntary when it interfered with what was happening. Now, as it happened more frequently during the game, my child was able to then not attend to it as much. They knew that it wasn't so important that they had to attend to it for what they were doing. So again, two types of attention. Most of the time it's intentional. But there are times that are involuntary where we distract our attention. All right, so the next topic that we're going to cover is also very important to us as clinicians, talking about how we're processing this information. Is it automatic or is it controlled? And I think this automatic processing is sometimes oft referred to as reflexive activity. And again, there's a lot of information to suggest that these aren't necessarily reflexes, but it's automatic processing. So automatic processing is fast. It does not take a lot of our attention. So we can do multiple things at once. So we're doing parallel things. So we can do two things at once, and they can happen at the same time, and neither will be interfered with. As we talked about a few minutes ago when we talked about interference, we can now carry on two activities and there is no interference to either of them. And it's non-volitional. So a lot of times we're not doing a lot of processing. It's happening sort of rather quickly and it appears rather effortless. Singer, Lidor, and Cora actually in 1993 found that motor skills improve when the subjects are focusing on the target and letting the movement occur versus focusing on what they're doing. So trying to process something potentially that could be um, automatically being processed. So not a lot of attention. By intentionally trying to control that processing, we may actually slow down what's occurring. There also might be some influence here of that external versus internal control as well. Controlled processing is slow. It takes a lot of our attention, so it's demanding. We can end up with interference. It's more serial in nature, and it's very strongly volitional. So potentially some of those things that start out as controlled processing, as we practice and we learn better, they become more automatic. So I gave you the example a couple slides ago about learning how to drive a manual transmission. And when I was learning, that processing of shifting the gear, maneuvering the pedals, the two pedals, and coordinating all that was very controlled. I almost had to like repeat it in my mind. Okay, clutch in, shift the gear, release the gas slowly. But now it's very automatic. So I don't even think about shifting the gears and I'm driving down the road. All I think about are things that are coming up in my path. So some of this, again, processing that we sort of refer to as reflexive probably has more of an automatic versus reflexive process. It's probably more automatic. So again, something to think about as we're looking at new learners, and again, we'll cover this again when we get to motor learning, versus somebody who's very well rehearsed. So some of this processing that is very demanding and needs a lot of control initially probably shifts into being more automatic as we get more rehearsed at things. All right, so the next 3 slides, we're going to talk about theories of attention. I basically want you to just know there's a lot of different theories of attention. Some of them add different pieces of sort of ideas to the picture. I'm going to really quickly review the next 3 slides. In the figure on this slide, these are all single channel theories, so suggesting that you can parallel process until you get to a point, and I've outlined 4 potentials here that have been reviewed in the literature. So you can parallel process until you get to stimulus identification. So multiple things are coming in and then you can't process multiple pieces of information after you get to some point in the stimulus identification. So coming in, as you're processing, mid-processing, or late processing, that would reflect 1, 2, and 3. And then another idea is that you can multiple process lots of pieces of information coming in, but once you get to response selection, then you have to make a response. And so at that point, the processing becomes serial versus parallel. All right, so the figure, like I talked about in the slide previous to this, all of that figure is all representing single channel theories. So at some point, single channel theories say that you can parallel process, and then at some point, you can no longer parallel process. It must be serial. Flexible allocation capacity actually is just adding the idea that with different tasks and different requirements, that where that parallel and switch to serial processing changes based on the task. Okay, and now we're just going to continue with potential theories of attention. Again, don't spend a huge amount of time on these. I just want you to know that there's a lot of different theories. The multiple resource theories suggest that our attention has multiple different types of resource, and each has its own capacity. So each portion or resource has some point in which you can parallel process and then single process, and then there's the action selection theories that suggest that again, actions have been already selected, which block the ability to parallel process somewhere else. All right, so I'm going to give you two specific examples that are well documented in the literature, and they're actually labeled. So I just want to make you aware of these types of interference to sensory information processing. The first one is the Stroop effect, where you have an incompatibility. So it really goes back to that response selection and incompatibility between the way you've previously learned something and the way that the information is being presented to you at the moment. A great example of this is the Stroop effect, where you project on the wall and you ask somebody to um, read to you a word that is spelled. So you spell out the word red, but you spell it out in green ink. So those two things are incompatible. And what happens is it results in a longer response time. So there's this incompatibility at the response selection point, and so you have to choose which one, and it adds to your response. The second example is called the cocktail party. And this is actually an unintentional or that unintentional attention is being pulled somewhere and you don't intend for it. And an example of this, and the reason it's called the cocktail party, is if you're receiving some auditory stimuli that is important to you, that maybe overrides where your attention is, where you're trying to direct your attention. And again, it could be safety. It's maybe that you're detecting that might be very important to you, so you redirect your attention, and it's sort of unintentional. So if you're at a party and you're talking to somebody and somebody across the room shouts a name that is your name, your attention would be directed there. Or if you hear a very loud bang, which you may think is, unfortunately in today's society, a gunshot, your attention may be directed, and you despite the fact you're trying to listen to the conversation that's going on in front of you. All right, so now we're going to talk about the double stimulation paradigm. This is a really well rehearsed paradigm that's set up by psychologists. So in this slide, I'm going to explain to you what's actually happening and what the idea is. And then you can think about how this might apply to a clinical situation. And again, it doesn't have to be a sound and a light as a setup in this sort of paradigm. It can be any paradigm that we're experiencing in the natural environment. So in this particular paradigm and then the figure, what the behavior or what the mover is receiving is a sound, and they're told that when they hear the sound they need to do something with their right hand, and when they see a light they need to do something with their left hand. And they're not necessarily, they may rehearse hearing the sound and using the right hand, and then rehearse and see the light and use their left hand. But in this paradigm, they're being presented, both of the stimuli are being presented before you've had a chance to react, but they're not being presented simultaneously. In the figure, you receive the sound, which is stimulus 1. And then there's a period between receiving that stimuli and receiving the second stimuli, which is the light. And this is called the stimulus onset asynchrony, so the time between those two. And then you can see that there's the two reactions, and there's a reaction time between getting the sound, which is the first stimuli, and producing the first response. And then you see a second reaction time between getting the second stimuli, which is the light, and then producing the second response time. The time between the two responses is called the psychological refractory period. And you can see over the bottom, over the x-axis, that's time. So that's sort of the paradigm and the way it's set up. And now we'll go to the next slide and we'll talk about the research related to this paradigm, which can be easily applied then to any sort of activities that we're doing in the clinic or in the natural environment. So the double stimulation paradigm. So again, to review, the stimulus onset asynchrony is the time between the onset of the two stimuli, so the signals to go or the external sensory information coming in that deems to you that you need to take some sort of action. The psychological refractory period, again, is the difference between the response 1 and response 2. Um, there is interference of response 2 when the stimulus 1 is present, and that is compared to when the stimulus 1 is not present. So when you're doing two things, there is going to be an interference, and that psychological refractory period represents that. Davis was the one that first started this, and again, this is old stuff done in psychology. It started in 1959, but it has been replicated numerous times with numerous different stimuli, with numerous different responses, and is accepted as applicable to things that we see in the clinic and in the natural environment. So the first thing that we know is there's going to be a delay in the second response. And that is decreased the longer the period is between the two stimuli. So the longer time that we have to process the first stimuli before the second stimuli comes, we actually see the decrease in the delay that second response is produced. So the farther along we get in processing, in that information processing process, before we get that second stimuli, the decrease, the lower the delay will be, or the shorter the delay will be in the second production of the second response. There is going to be a delay in that second response, even though the first response is produced. So we're still going to see a delay. And there's something called a grouping effect. So if the stimulus onset asynchrony, or the two stimuli, are presented within 10 milliseconds of each other, what we actually do is we group those two stimuli and we produce one response. So we sort of group everything together. Now we know, based on just information processing alone, that when we have a more complex response, which if you have two stimuli and need two responses, the one response that you group would be more complex. You will still see a delay in the response time. So again, that goes back to our basic ideas about information processing. Some things that affect the refractory period or the response time: practice. With practice, you can decrease the delay hugely. Potentially not eliminate, but definitely with practice, you can decrease the delay in response time too, which is why practice is so very important. The second thing is the complexity of the number of choices that you have in your response is going to also affect the response time delays. So if the stimulus 1 has a potential of 2 choices versus a potential of 5 choices, when you have 5 choices, your response time will be greater. And again, that goes back to the stuff that we've already talked about for information processing. The more complex or the more choices for a response, the longer the delay will be, or the response time will be. And again, very much like we would predict based on what we've already talked about, the stimulus response compatibility. So if there's high compatibility between the stimuli and the response, something that you've already learned, something that makes logical sense or is spatially compatible, like light on left, left hand, those are going to have shorter response times than if the compatibility is not as strong. So poor compatibility would add to the response time. So all of these things should make sense, and then that grouping effect gets back to our dual tasking that we see a lot. But again, you need to think about, when you're doing dual tasking, are you presenting the stimuli simultaneously, or at least close enough where we bunch those stimuli into one bigger response, or are they separated, in which case we would probably have to deal with them separately. The last topic that we're going to talk about under attention is anticipation. And anticipation is really applicable to what we're doing. We do this in our natural environment a lot. And there's two types of anticipation we're going to talk about. Spatial anticipation, where we know a response is going to be needed. And so what we do is we pull up the response that we would select, and we do this beforehand, before receiving the stimulus. We pull it up, we maybe potentially program it to some extent, and then all we do is we wait for the time or getting that signal, and then we activate it. Temporal anticipation is when we know when a response is going to be needed. We may pull up a couple of them. It may be that we don't know exactly which one. We may eliminate down to a few responses that we need that will help us. And then we sort of activate it on a delay, anticipating when it might happen. And so if there is an irregular, or we're not very good at anticipating the exact time, if it's shorter than or longer than, that can sort of throw us off a little bit, and there may be a longer or shorter response time. But that's an issue, and that can also occur. So there's temporal anticipation. But the thing about anticipation that's really interesting is if we are wrong about what is anticipated or what's going to be needed. And if we are wrong, either spatially, so we don't anticipate the right activity that's needed or the right response, or on time, so if we get fooled by how much time, if it's much shorter or much longer than we anticipate, that can actually occur in a longer response time. And so it costs us, that error costs us in the long run, and can cost us more response time than if we didn't anticipate it, if we were just going through the process. So when we think about anticipation, you can see by the figure below that we can potentially skip some parts of information processing. So we may still need to identify the stimuli when it's needed, but we can maybe beforehand select a response and potentially even, which isn't in the figure, program a response. It may be that we can't program the response. We may have to see the actual stimuli to select the response, but if we can also eliminate down to maybe limit the number of responses that we might need, which again helps us on that reaction time. All right, so anticipation, very important for our patients in real life. We do this all the time, throughout the day, repeatedly. All right, so now I want you to take a few minutes, think about all these little separate topics that we've talked about in relation to attention, and we need to start thinking about how they apply to what we're doing with our examples and in the clinic. So if we think about attention, the types of attention that we're using, what type of attention is required, where potentially could our clients not have a limitation in attention. For patients with ADHD, it's very clear it's sustained attention. If we think about where we focus our learners' attention, or our participants' attention, and again, very, very clear evidence that external focus is a better way to teach somebody, and this is something that PTs violate, or clinicians can violate all the time, by telling somebody to focus on hip range. That's an internal focus, versus thinking about maybe how the shoe is contacting the floor. That would be an external focus. So you got to find ways to try to make whatever focus they have external, and that may be by putting something on your patient, or telling them to focus on that area where the action is actually taking place, which again is lots of times external to our body. When we think about interference and how what else is going on in the environment that could interfere and maybe involuntarily pull their attention away. When we think about automatic processing versus controlled processing, and how much attention that takes And again, really think about some of those things that you're calling reflexive. Are they a reflex, a true reflex, or is it really just automatic processing, which I think most of the time when we say reflex, it's really a monosynaptic reflexes that we have. It's really attention, an automatic attention. Think about theories of attention and how long can you parallel versus single process. And again, that may have something to do with learning. And then interference of a task, which we gave two very classic examples of interference. And then the very interesting topic of dual single task and how doing two things at once interferes with our ability to respond. And lastly, but again, also very interesting, is this idea of anticipation and how we use this on a daily basis, but how, if we're not careful, it can end up costing us in the long run. All right, so I want you to maybe review some of these ideas, go back and try to apply it to your client.